My father, Franz Waxman, was a genuine wunderkind. A little kid, 5 years old, crawls up on the piano and starts playing by himself. And it was just his passion for his entire life. When he graduated from high school, he said to my grandfather, "I want to go to music school." And he said, "Well, what kind of a job is that? You know, you've got to have a real job. You know, go to a bank." And so they struck a bargain, and the bargain was if my father would work in a bank for a year, his father, my grandfather, would take him to a trip to Dresden, Germany to study music. And so my father hung in there, did his year in the bank as a teller, hated every minute, every day of it, and went off to Dresden to study music.
Although his music sensibilities were Middle European, he was very quick to pick up what I would describe as an American kind of energy.
From Dresden, he went to Berlin, had no money, started playing piano in the Tingle Tangle Club, which was owned by a writer, director, composer named Friedrich Hollander. There are many famous Marlene Dietrich songs, specifically Falling in Love Again in The Blue Angel. And it was, in fact, Hollander that gave my father his big break to become the orchestrator of The Blue Angel. And that was at the UFA Studios, which was the MGM of Germany and Berlin in the 1930s. And it was there that he met his lifelong friends and colleagues like Billy Wilder and Peter Lorre, Karl Freund, this famous cinematographer. They were, in fact, all working as young men in the Berlin studios until the advent of Hitler. And then they were out of there.
He was very interesting as a composer, because he was another one of the great Middle Europeans who came here, courtesy of Hitler.
They went to Paris, and as did all the other people whose names I've just mentioned. They worked in the French film industry while sort of getting their lives together to come to Hollywood.
They came to Hollywood as outsiders, as genius outsiders, who then were embraced by that community, actually ended up defining that community in a way because of their work.
My parents went to a New Year's Eve party, and at this party, my father is introduced to a director. And this man says to him, "I've been looking all over the world for you." My father goes right after the turn of the year over to Universal, and of course the director was James Whale, and the picture was Bride of Frankenstein. So at 29, he got his big break, wrote one of the first symphonic scores, and on the basis of that was made music director of Universal Pictures.
Each of the studios had studio orchestras. I don't remember the actual size of the orchestras, but they were a full complement, strings, woodwinds, brass. They were probably somewhere in the vicinity of 60 players. And each of the studios had such an orchestra.
In the case of Sunset Boulevard, it was one of his first pictures at Paramount. He was, after all, the new composer at the music department. Victor Young was the senior composer. He was assigned this film, brought to Paramount not by Billy Wilder, who was under contract, but by Hal Wallace, whom he had done films for at Warner Brothers.
Young man, tell me something. How long is a movie script these days? I mean, how many pages?
Depends on what it is, a Donald Duck or a Joan of Arc.
This is to be a very important picture. I've written it myself, took me years.
Looks like enough for 6 important pictures.
I cannot imagine any composer fulfilling musically what Billy Wilder had in his mind, especially for this story, than Franz Waxman, since they were best friends, since they had to escape Berlin together.
The relationship goes back to a time when my mother was introduced to my father by Billy. So they were very close. In fact, by the time I came around, Billy actually named me because my parents couldn't agree on a name. So my parents didn't name me, Billy Wilder did.
When I arrived here, Franz Waxman was one of the giants. I arrived here in 1950, and film music was full of giants at that time, when you stop to think of it. I mean, it was Franz Waxman, Miklas Rozsa, Max Steiner, Alfred Duman, David Raxon, Hugo Friedhofer. It was an amazing town with amazing people.
Those idiot producers. Those imbeciles. Haven't they got any eyes? Have they forgotten what a star looks like? I'll show them. I'll be up there again, so help me.
Usually the composer reported to the music director. And generally the first screening of the film was with the head of the music department. But probably in the case of Sunset Boulevard, it was with Billy.
When I first came to Hollywood in the 50s, I met one director in the first 10 years that I worked here. Didn't even meet the directors in those days.
My father then would see the film alone, and that was the most important time for him, because he'd really think about what's the texture of this film going to be like. Not what is Norma's theme going to be, what's Joe's theme, but what kind of a feel do I want to have to this score? What's the orchestration going to be? What's the mood? How am I going to approach this? He saw the film with Billy. He probably had lunch afterwards and talked about it, and he came back with some musical ideas after what's called spotting the film, which is where you sit with the cue sheets, which are a minute or second-by-second breakdown of the film.
And that is what spotting a film is all about. It's about sitting down with the filmmaker and deciding we should have music in this place, but not in this place.
And the composer decides what scenes will have and what scenes will not have music.
Early on, for instance, at Metro, you spotted the film not with a director, a filmmaker, but with a specialist whose job it was to assist the composer in spotting the film.
The cue sheets are delivered on almost a daily basis, because at the same time the director is cutting the film. So as the cue sheets arrive, the composer sits down and begins to write the score.
In the old days, the score did not make it into the film until the film was locked. So there were no changes in those days, because you were working with a film that was final.
Full score is everything from flutes down to basses. And my father would then approve the full score, and then that would be taken to the studio and copied, and parts would be made for the recording session. Part of the process of getting the cue sheets every day or every other day and rewriting before you actually record a score are changes that can happen. And it is no secret that Sunset Boulevard had an original opening that did not survive the first preview. And interestingly enough, the music that my father composed for the final, if you will, opening of the film, main title and first scene, were what he had originally written for the first scene, Conversing Corpses, which was discarded.
I think Billy Wilder experimented obviously in two different ways of starting that picture, but fundamentally, since Joe Gillis is dead at the beginning of the picture and is talking to us, we know that he's going to be dead for the rest of this picture, and he's going to end up dead.
And I think it's really interesting that both the director, Wilder, and the composer, Waxman, were able to take the music and condense it so that it worked in both situations.
When the movie starts, we hear music of a chase. It's a chase. Physically, obviously, it's a chase of a car. We're not sure why or whatever it is, but it's a chase. But obviously, from a symbolic point of view, these are people who are trying to escape death. In the case of Norma, it's death of a career, therefore a person's soul. She's living, but she's dead, and death is waiting at the doorstep for her. For Joe, it's the bill collector. It's how do you make a living out there with a car that you can't even pay for, and you're just trying to make your payments in, so death is waiting for him too. When we first see Norma, she has her theme, which is a tango. Joe's is bebop, because he's a young, hip, hot writer. You know, he's a kid who's on the make and on the run. So these two themes, plus the theme of the chase, work all the way through the picture. The keys that they're written in, the way they're orchestrated, one fits into another, which means, from my point of view, that Franz Waxman, who was trained legitimately as a composer in Berlin, was actually thinking of these scores as being composed right through. In other words, when the music stops and there's just dialogue, and then the music picks up again, it can pick up again. In other words, it completely works as a through-composed set of ideas.
Sometimes, when we got stuck, we'd make a little tour of the drowsing lot. Not talking much. Just wandering down alleys between the sound stages.
Well, I've always found what he did with the studio stroll particularly imaginative. This is, of course, the scene when Holden and Olson are working on their collaborative screenplay at night on the Paramount lot, and they would take breaks. And they would walk on the deserted streets, the old sets, and their dialogue, of course, and this is where they first really fall in love. And for this scene, my father created a parody of Paramount on Parade. My father slowed it down to almost a waltz, and it becomes the love theme. I thought that was an amazing use of musical invention that not many people are aware of when they first see the film. The tango theme for Norma is bizarre, and it is bizarre, obviously, on purpose to accentuate her character. And then from that point on, it deteriorates musically and becomes more subdued as the film goes on and as she becomes wilder. In fact, in the scene where she is being manicured and she's pumping herself up and trying to lose weight, sort of a montage, my father adds a gypsy violin over the tango to accelerate the mad motif, where even while she's working this hard to make herself 20-something again, it's all in her head. I mean, the music tells you that.
He was a brilliant dramatist, which I think is very important in a film music composer. It was just not a question of writing a good line of music, but it was appropriate to the action and to the scene.
Billy wanted at the end, in the famous staircase scene, to use Richard Strauss because of Salome. And my father said, Billy, let me try something, and if you don't like it, you know, Strauss it is. And he wrote the Norma a Salome cue, which is called in the film The Comeback. And Billy liked it and kept it.
Life, which can be strangely merciful, had taken pity on Norma Desmond. The dream she had clung to so desperately had enfolded her.
My father won his first Oscar for Sunset Boulevard, and his second the next year for A Place in the Sun, 1951. And this is the only time in the history of the Academy that a composer has won in 2 consecutive years.
I knew these guys were good, these composers, but I also learned that they actually composed this music for whatever going on with the timings. You know, this has to be 3 minutes and 15 seconds, this has to be here, we spot the picture so it only happens here. Whatever they had to do technically that they overcame the technical limitations and wrote through composed symphonic works.
He was a great figure here, not only as a composer of film music, but he was a force for musical life in Los Angeles. He had a concert series that he conducted at UCLA, Royce Hall, and conducted, I think it was the premiere of Prokofiev's Seventh Symphony. I mean, things of that sort.
My father was really the consummate professional. I mean, I think he brought everything to the table to every assignment, and I think every director and producer got their money's worth.